In October of 1872, an elderly cartographer named Wilhelm Brown walked into a Philadelphia publishing house carrying a leather portfolio he claimed contained the last honest map of North America. He told the editor that everything published after 1867 was a lie, that entire cities had been erased, that coastlines had been redrawn, that mountain ranges shown on maps for 200 years had simply vanished from the new editions. The editor dismissed him as a confused old man. 3 days later, Wilhelm Brown was found dead in his boarding room. The portfolio was never recovered. What he claimed to have seen, what he said he was ordered to remove from the maps he drew for 40 years, remained buried with him until now. If you're finding value in this investigation, make sure you're subscribed. I cover forbidden history and suppressed cartography every week, and this is one of the deepest dives I've done. Hit that button now so you don't miss what's coming. The meeting between Braun and the editor lasted nearly 3 hours. According to surviving correspondence, Braun arrived at the publishing house just after noon on October the 14th, 1822. He was described as gaunt, his hands shaking as he placed the portfolio on the editor's desk. The editor, Thomas Whitmore, had agreed to the meeting as a courtesy. Braun had written him several letters over previous months, each more insistent, claiming he possessed evidence of systematic falsification of American cartography. Whitmore assumed he was dealing with senility. What he got was 3 hours of methodical documentation. Wilhelm Brown wasn't a nobody. Born in Bavaria in 1801, he apprenticed under some of the most respected cartographers in Europe before emigrating to the United States in 1824. By 1830, he was the lead cartographer for the American Geographical Society. His maps were used by railroad companies, the military, and the federal government. When surveyors needed accuracy, they called Braun. When Congress debated territory boundaries, they consulted his work. For 4 decades, his maps were considered the gold standard. His reputation was built on precision. Unlike many cartographers who relied on second-hand reports, Braun insisted on personal verification. Between 1835 and 1860, he made 17 documented expeditions across the American interior. He travelled with survey teams, military expeditions, and railroad scouting parties. He carried his instruments into territories not yet formally mapped. He kept meticulous field notes, cross-referencing observations with earlier maps drawn by French trappers, Spanish explorers, and the handful of American surveyors who preceded him. But something changed in 1867. That year, Braun abruptly resigned from the society. No explanation was given publicly. His colleagues reported that he seemed disturbed, distracted, unwilling to discuss his work. He stopped taking commissions. He refused to participate in multi-year survey projects that had defined his career. Friends said he spent his final years obsessively comparing old maps to new ones, annotating discrepancies, writing letters to publishers that were never answered. And then came that final visit to the publishing house in 1872, where he made his stunning claim. So what exactly did Wilhelm Brown say was removed from the maps? According to the one surviving account, a letter written by the publishing house editor to a colleague, Braun claimed there were 3 categories of deliberate omissions. First, entire settlements. Not small villages or temporary camps, but established cities with populations in the thousands, complete with infrastructure, harbours and rail connections. Second, geographical features. Rivers that had been charted for centuries, bays that appeared on every maritime map, and mountain ranges that early explorers had documented in meticulous detail. Third, and this is where things get strange, architectural structures. Massive buildings, fortifications, and what Braun called monumental civic works that had no clear origin or purpose. Let's start with the settlements. In his portfolio, Braun reportedly had comparison maps. On one side, a map he himself had drawn in 1856 showing the Dakota Territory. On that map, along the Missouri River, there were 7 marked settlements. Names like New Batavia, Reinhold, and Germania. Not trading posts or forts, cities. The map showed grid patterns, harbour markings, the symbols cartographers used to indicate permanent urban infrastructure. On the other side, he had the 1868 official government survey map of the same region. Those 7 cities were gone. In their place, empty plains, no notation of abandoned settlements, no historical markers, just blank space where thousands of people had supposedly lived. The editor who saw these maps wrote that Braun became agitated when discussing them. He insisted these weren't errors, these weren't cases of overestimating settlement size or misidentifying temporary camps. He said he had personally visited 4 of these locations in the early 1850s. He had walked their streets, he had slept in their hotels, he had drawn the maps from direct observation, not second-hand reports. According to Whitmore's letter, Braun described New Batavia in detail. He said it sat on a bluff overlooking the Missouri, with a deep-water harbour capable of handling steamboats. The main street ran east-west for nearly a mile, lined with brick buildings 3 and 4 stories tall. There was a customs house, a Masonic hall, and gasworks providing street lighting. He estimated the population at 3,000 to 5,000 people. He claimed he stayed there for 4 days in May of 1853 while waiting for a military escort. He drew the city from direct observation, taking measurements, sketching, and noting the street grid. But if you search historical archives for any mention of New Batavia, Reinhold, or Germania in the Dakota Territory, you'll find nothing at all. No census records, no land deeds, no newspaper mentions. It's as if these places never existed. Yet Braun was not the only cartographer who marked them. Then there are the geographical features. Braun claimed that entire waterways had been removed from maps. He specifically mentioned a major river in the Ohio Valley that appeared on every map prior to 1865 but vanished from all subsequent editions. He called it the Serpent River, though that name appears nowhere in modern records. According to his annotations, this river ran parallel to the Ohio River for nearly 200 miles before diverging north into what's now Indiana. Early French explorers mentioned it. British colonial maps showed it. Even Lewis and Clark's expedition notes allegedly contained references to a major river in that region that doesn't match any currently recognized waterway. Braun's description of the Serpent River was specific. He said it was navigable for steamboats for most of its length, with an average depth of 12 to 15 feet during normal water levels. It was fed by numerous tributaries flowing down from elevated terrain to the east. The river's course created a natural boundary between different soil types, which affected settlement patterns and agricultural development in the region. French traders in the 1740s used it as a route to transport furs from the interior to the Ohio River, avoiding the longer route down the Wabash. According to Braun, he personally surveyed portions of the Serpent River in 1847 while working on a comprehensive map of the Northwest Territory for a Philadelphia publishing house. His field notes described crossing the river by ferry at 3 different points, taking depth soundings and mapping its confluence with the Ohio River near what is now the Indiana-Ohio border. He noted that several small settlements existed along its banks, primarily trading posts and mill towns that used the river for power and transport. Again, if you search for the Serpent River today, you'll find nothing. But if you look at French maps from the 1750s, there is a river marked in approximately that location. It's labelled differently, usually as Rivière du Serpent or some variation. The scale is primitive, but it's there. A 1784 British military map shows what it calls the Great Serpentine River running through the same region. An 1802 American territorial map marks it as the Serpent, with notations indicating it was a significant waterway. Then, starting around 1865, it begins to disappear. An 1867 railroad survey map of the region shows the Ohio River and the Wabash, but the space where the Serpent River should be contains only small creeks and seasonal streams. An 1870 geological survey makes no mention of any major river in that location. By 1875, it's as if the river never existed. The modern explanation, when historians address this at all, is that early cartographers misidentified the Wabash River or exaggerated the size of tributaries. but that doesn't explain why multiple sources spanning different countries and decades all marked a major river in the same location that somehow doesn't exist today. The mountains are even stranger. Braun claimed that a range in the Pacific Northwest, which he called the Titan Range, was systematically removed from maps starting in 1866. He said these mountains were visible from the coast, that they appeared on Russian, Spanish, and early American charts, and that they were tall enough to be seen from hundreds of miles away. He drew them himself in 1842 while working on a comprehensive survey of the Oregon Territory. Now, you might think this is easy to verify. Mountains don't just disappear, but the Pacific Northwest in the mid-1800s was poorly surveyed. The region was contested territory, passed between British, Spanish, and American control. Most of the interior was unmapped. What we do know is that there are multiple references in early explorer journals to mountain ranges that don't appear on modern maps. Captain George Vancouver, in his 1792 expedition, described a coastal range that doesn't match the Cascades or the Olympics. Russian fur traders mentioned mountains inland from their settlements that seem to have no modern equivalent. Braun's field notes from his 1842 expedition are partially preserved in the American Geographical Society archives, though the maps that accompanied them are missing. In those notes, he describes approaching the Oregon coast and seeing a mountain range to the east that he estimated was at least 100 miles inland. He noted that the peaks were snow-covered year-round, and that they formed a continuous barrier running north-south for what appeared to be several hundred miles. He called them the Titan Range because of their massive scale, and he noted that Spanish maps from the 1770s marked them as the Sierra de los Gigantes, the Mountains of the Giants. He attempted to reach them during that expedition, but was turned back by difficult terrain and hostile encounters with indigenous groups who, according to his notes, considered the mountains sacred and forbidden to outsiders. He never made it close enough for detailed surveying, so his map markings were based on distant observation and rough triangulation. But he was adamant that the mountains were real, substantial, and should appear on any comprehensive map of the region. By the 1870s, they were gone from official maps. The space where Braun had marked them was either left blank or filled in with different smaller ranges that didn't match his descriptions. When he questioned this during his final years, he was told that improved surveying techniques had revealed his earlier observations to be in error, but he never accepted that explanation. Braun's claim was that these mountains were deliberately omitted from later maps, not because they didn't exist, but because acknowledging them would raise questions about who built the structures on them. And that brings us to the third category, the structures. This is where Wilhelm Braun's story moves from historical curiosity to something else entirely. Because according to the editor's letter, Braun didn't just claim that cities and geographical features were removed. He claimed that the maps he was ordered to revise contained markings for massive stone structures, fortifications, and what he described as impossible architecture. Buildings that predated any known American construction, walls that stretched for miles, complexes that could house tens of thousands of people. He said these structures were marked on early Spanish maps, that French explorers had documented them, that the first American surveyors in the West had included them in their reports, and then, starting in the 1860s, cartographers were told to stop including them. No formal directive, no official memo, just quiet instructions from government surveyors and corporate clients. Remove the old structures, don't mark the ruins. If asked, say they were mapping errors. Braun claimed he was personally involved in this process. In 1863, he was contracted by a railroad company to update maps of a route through Utah. The original survey map from 1845 showed a series of large stone buildings along the proposed route. Rectangular structures, each over 100 feet long, arranged in geometric patterns. The surveyor's notes described them as ancient, constructed from precisely cut stone blocks, and completely abandoned. But when Braun submitted his updated map in 1864, he was told to remove those markings. The railroad representative said the structures didn't exist. When Braun protested that he was copying from an official survey, he was told the survey was in error. The 1855 survey was conducted by a team led by Captain John Gunnison. The original documents are in the National Archives, but the accompanying maps are listed as missing. What survives are Gunnison's written notes, and they reference extensive stone ruins along the central route through Utah Territory. Gunnison described them as unlike anything built by known indigenous peoples. He noted that the stones were cut with precision, fitted without mortar, and arranged in patterns suggesting careful planning. Gunnison mentioned one structure he called the Long Hall, a rectangular building approximately 150 feet long, constructed from blocks of reddish stone. The walls still stood 12 feet high. There were no visible doors, only narrow openings placed high on the walls. The floor was paved with flat stones, and in the centre was a sunken rectangular area. He found 6 of these structures in a line, each separated by 200 yards, all oriented north-south. Beyond them were remains of smaller structures, mostly foundation stones. Gunnison noted no signs of recent habitation, and that local indigenous people refused to approach the ruins. When Braun was contracted to update the route in 1863, he was given Gunnison's maps and notes. He included the structures in his draft, marking them as archaeological sites. When he submitted the map, he was called to a meeting with the project manager and a federal surveyor. They told him the structures were mapping errors, that Gunnison had misidentified natural rock formations, and that including them would confuse land claims. Braun argued. He pointed out Gunnison's detailed descriptions and specific measurements. He was told the railroad needed maps reflecting current conditions, not historical curiosities. He was paid a bonus and asked to submit a revised version without the structures. He removed them. He redrew the map, and when published there was no mention of stone structures in that region. But Braun kept the original survey map. He kept copies of every map he was told to alter, and over 8 years he watched the pattern repeat. Stone walls in Colorado, geometric earthworks in Kansas, massive foundations in Nevada, all marked on pre-1860 maps, all gone by 1870. Another case involved a Nevada site on an 1858 Army Corps of Engineers survey. That survey marked what the surveyor described as extensive stone foundations covering 10 acres. The notes indicated a grid layout with clear pathways, suggesting a planned settlement. The surveyor estimated the original structures could have housed several thousand people. Braun saw this in 1865 while mapping Nevada territory for a mining company. He copied the site onto his map. The company's representative questioned it. Braun explained he was copying from an official Army survey. The representative said the Army had resurveyed and found no structures. Braun requested the updated survey. He was told it wasn't available for civilian review. He asked to visit the site personally. He was told that wasn't necessary, and his map should reflect current surveys. He removed the structures. In 1867, the Army published a new Nevada map, where the 1858 survey marked foundations was labelled uninhabited desert. No notation of ruins, no reference to the earlier survey. These weren't isolated incidents. Braun claimed involvement in, or awareness of, at least 15 cases where features were removed from maps between 1863 and 1867. Each time the pattern was the same. An older survey showed the feature, a new map was commissioned, the cartographer included it. The client requested removal, citing improved surveys. The feature disappeared. What made Braun suspicious was the coordination. These weren't random corrections. The removals happened within a specific time frame, targeted the same kinds of features, and were handled with quiet efficiency. No formal announcements, no published corrections, no explanations, just systematic erasure. The question is why? Why would the government, railroad companies, and geographical societies coordinate to remove these features from maps? Braun had a theory. He believed these structures predated American settlement, that they were evidence of a prior civilization, one advanced enough to build on a scale that rivaled anything in Europe. And he believed that acknowledging them would undermine the entire narrative of westward expansion. Because if these cities these buildings, these engineered waterways already existed, then the land wasn't wilderness. It was an empty frontier waiting to be tamed. It was occupied, or it had been. And if it had been occupied by a sophisticated civilization that built in stone, that planned cities, that engineered the landscape, then what happened to them? Where did they go? And who benefited from erasing them from the record? In his meeting with Whitmore, Braun laid out his theory. He believed the continent had been home to what he called the old builders. He thought they were responsible for the stone structures, the planned cities, the engineered waterways. He believed they either died out from catastrophe or simply vanished, leaving their infrastructure behind. And he believed that when American expansion reached these sites in the mid-1800s, the decision was made to erase evidence of them. The doctrine of manifest destiny depended on the notion that the land was largely empty and unused. Indigenous peoples were portrayed as nomadic or primitive. The land was wilderness, waiting to be civilized. But if the land already contained cities built of stone, roads, harbours and infrastructure, then the justification for westward expansion became complicated. Acknowledging advanced prior construction would raise uncomfortable questions. Who built these cities? If indigenous, then they were far more advanced than suggested, undermining justification for displacement. If not indigenous, then who? And if a sophisticated civilization existed and vanished, what guarantee was there that American civilization wouldn't meet the same fate? Braun believed the solution was to erase the evidence, not physically, the structures were too large, but cartographically. If the maps didn't show them, if surveys didn't document them, if the official record treated the land as empty, then settlers could proceed without confronting uncomfortable truths. The ruins could be dismissed, ignored, or not discussed. And over time, as old maps were replaced, the memory would fade. Braun never got to make his case publicly. 3 days after his publishing house visit, he was found dead. The official cause was heart failure. He was 71, so not immediately suspicious, but the timing is notable. The portfolio was never found. His boarding room had been searched, papers were missing, and the editor received a visit from 2 men identifying as federal surveyors. They asked to see any materials Braun had left. The editor said he had nothing. They told him it would be unwise to discuss Braun's claims. The circumstances of Braun's death were documented in a Philadelphia coroner's report dated October 18, 1872. Braun was found in his room at a boarding house on Market Street by the landlady when he failed to come down for breakfast. The door was locked from inside, no signs of struggle. The room was in disarray, with papers scattered, attributed to Braun's habit of working late, surrounded by maps and documents. The coroner noted Braun appeared to have died in his sleep, likely from cardiac arrest. No marks on the body, no evidence of poisoning, no indication of foul play. Death ruled natural causes. Braun was buried 3 days later in a cemetery outside Philadelphia. Fewer than a dozen people attended. But the landlady gave a different account in a letter to her sister 2 weeks later. That letter, found in a family archive in the 1950s, describes the room differently. Papers everywhere, as if someone had searched for something. Braun's trunk opened, personal effects strewn about. Most notably, the large leather portfolio he'd been carrying 3 days earlier was missing. She also mentioned hearing voices in his room the evening before his death. She assumed a visitor, unusual because Braun rarely received guests. She heard what sounded like an argument, furniture being moved, then silence. After finding him dead the next morning, she wondered if she should have investigated. She never reported this to police or the coroner. In her letter, she said she was frightened by a visit the day after Braun's death from 2 well-dressed men asking about his belongings. They said they were colleagues from the Geographical Society there to collect his professional materials. She let them into the room. They took several boxes of papers and maps. They told her not to discuss Braun's work as it involved sensitive government contracts. She complied. The letter describing all of this, the one that survived, was never meant to be public. It was a private correspondence between the editor and a colleague in Boston, found decades later in an estate sale. Without it, we'd have no record of what Wilhelm Braun claimed. So what was really removed from the maps? Let's consider the possibilities. 1. Braun was simply wrong. Old maps were inaccurate, and the corrections made in the 1860s reflected better surveying techniques and more accurate data. This is the mainstream explanation. Early cartographers made mistakes. They marked settlements that never grew beyond a few buildings. They drew rivers that were seasonal or misidentified. But that doesn't explain the consistency. It doesn't explain why multiple cartographers, working independently, marked the same features. It doesn't explain why the removals happened within a very specific time frame concentrated in the years immediately following the Civil War. 2. There was a deliberate effort to simplify maps for practical reasons. Railroads needed clear, standardized maps. The government needed maps that reflected current settlements. Features that served no commercial purpose were removed. That's plausible, except it doesn't explain why the removals were kept quiet. If it was just practical cartography, why not annotate the changes? Instead, the changes were made silently. The old maps were replaced. 3. The removals were part of a coordinated effort to erase evidence of a prior civilization. The idea that North America was once home to an advanced culture that built in stone and engineered landscapes, and that in the mid-1800s, evidence was systematically removed from the official record. Braun's maps, if they existed, would have been direct evidence. Cities that predated American settlement, structures that couldn't be explained, waterways that suggested large-scale engineering, all scrubbed from the maps. There's no smoking gun, no government directive. But there are patterns. Dozens of pre-18160 maps show features missing from post-18165 maps. Explorer journals describe things not found on later surveys. What happened to Braun's portfolio? If it contained side-by-side comparisons, if it documented specific locations where structures were removed, it would be historically significant. But it's never surfaced. Some believe it was destroyed. Others think it's still out there, waiting to be found. The story of the last cartographer is about what we choose to remember and forget. Maps aren't neutral. They're political. They reflect power. In the 1860s and 70s, as the United States consolidated control, the maps were redrawn to match the story the country wanted to tell. Wilhelm Braun was a witness to that process. He saw the old world erased for the new one. He saw cities removed because acknowledging them complicated the narrative. And when he tried to speak up, he was silenced. Whether you believe his story depends on evidence. The mainstream view is that he was confused, that old maps were corrected, that revisions are normal. The alternative is that he was telling the truth, that he was part of a campaign to rewrite history, that the maps we use today are sanitized versions. What we know is this. Maps from before 1867 show things that maps from after don't. Cities, rivers, mountains, structures. They're absent from later ones. No one disputes that. The question is whether those features were removed because they were errors or because they were inconvenient truths. And if they were inconvenient truths, then what else was removed? What other evidence was quietly erased to support the idea that the continent was wilderness before American expansion? Wilhelm Braun died believing he was one of the last people who remembered what the maps used to show. Whether he was right or not, his story reminds us that history isn't fixed. It's written by those who control the narrative. And sometimes the most important stories are the ones that get erased before most people know they existed. I've linked sources and comparison maps in the description. If you want to go deeper into suppressed cartography, the video on screen breaks down the 1892 Chicago World's Fair and what happened to the buildings afterward. Thanks for watching.